We're talking about Lost Creek and
We
what
are.
an interesting history for the Wabash Valley. People may not have heard
You're
of
right.
the rich tradition. Let's start from the beginning. How did it come to be?
Well, in the beginning, actually in 1828, a gentleman named Bowen Roberts rode on horseback to this area from North Carolina. He had been sent as a scout to this area. The families, they were free black families that lived in North Carolina, farmers. They were looking for a new place to settle. They wanted to get away from the harassment because of the color of their skin. And they were looking for a new home. So Bowen came to Indiana on horseback, looked around, found what he thought was a marvelous place. He went back to his people and said, I have found a beautiful land. He said, it is so bountiful that there are fat hogs running through the forest with knives and forks in their backs. And I love that analogy. I think that's wonderful. So they decided that this might be the place for them, and they sold their properties that they owned in North Carolina, packed up all their household goods and their families in wagons and ox carts, and made the trip from North Carolina to the northeast part of Vigo County and settled there. So it was a long journey for them to make, but it was a place that they felt they would have the freedom that they were seeking. And as I say, they were free men. They were not slaves that were escaping from slavery.
Well, and just talking a little bit about that right there, how common or uncommon was that?
I think very uncommon. So those people had been prosperous in North Carolina, but as I said, oftentimes because of the color of their skin, they were harassed, even though they were a part of the free society in the South. And so they were looking for a better place.
How many families or roughly people?
There were
traveled?
6 families that came here with their, as I say, all their household belongings. They had sold their property. They came here, had money to buy property. They bought government land because they were essentially farming people. And they established the wonderful community of Lost Creek.
And once here, they
Yes.
established a community, and we know so much goes into that. What did they do? What were some of the things that they were able to accomplish even at that point in history?
At that early point in history, because by 1832 they were here and settling that area. They were very prosperous people. They were farmers originally. They built a church, they built a school, they actually built a community there and became very prosperous. In later generations were even more successful in the community. They became professional people as well. And I thought it was interesting that some of the original farmers who had purchased 40 acres at the end of their lifetimes were farming and owning 700 to 900 acres of land in that part of Vigo County, and were able to pass that on to their children and their children on down.
It seems so, like you said, uncommon, and it's not something that's discussed frequently, but from a historical standpoint, how big was that these freemen were able to come and settle in a place that was predominantly white? We obviously, the Emancipation Proclamation, all these things were happening and were very new.
Yes.
But racial prejudice was still very new. How big was it that they were able to have a community back then?
I think the reason that they were able to have such a wonderful community was amazing because there were Quaker settlers in this area, and they were very tolerant of all races and religions. But of course, the discrimination still existed in a different degree, I think, than they had suffered in North Carolina. So it's amazing to me that these people were able to become good neighbors and friends amongst that community. And still today, I think that relationship exists. And those people established themselves here as good people, hardworking people, people of religion. They had wonderful character in the area. And their children have gone on, and their children's children, to be integral parts of this community and to hold positions in this community of recognition. And they have brought much to our community. We can't say that discrimination did not exist, because it did, and it continued to exist through the years. But for some reason, that peaceful little part of our county seems to have gotten it right. Let's put it that way.
That's fantastic. You mentioned it. So many members of those families are still integral to Vigo County even today. Can you
Correct.
talk a little bit about that? How throughout the generations the community of Lost Creek has endured in Vigo County and the Wabash Valley?
The community has endured through many years. At one point, the state of Indiana recognized that area with century farms, because those farms have been in those families for over 100 years now. But their young people became professionals in this community. They were barbers, they were undertakers, they were grocers, they were all kinds of the trades that existed and they became a part of in the community. And today, those families are still putting their mark on our community in very positive ways.
So is it safe to say that without the Lost Creek community, Vigo County, the Wabash Valley, would not be the place that it is today?
I think so, because I think that that they showed that people of all races and religions could live together peacefully and prosper. And I think that they were the prime example of that in this area.
Let's talk a little bit about the Historical Society and its role in preserving and educating the public when it comes to the history about it. What are some of the things that you all are doing and that you all have recently done to better knowledge, to better the public's knowledge, that is, of Lost Creek, Black history, just things in general here?
We always try during the month of February, which is Black History Month, to put some sort of an exhibit up that relates to the history of the Black population in the area. We've done that for many years. When I first came here, we had a very small exhibit, and I asked a group of people from the community to come in and talk to me about what we should have in our exhibits here, how we should tell their stories, and what was offensive or not offensive as far as display. And so we had really good conversations, and we have developed an area in the museum that is dedicated to Black history, but we do then specific exhibits, major exhibits. We've done one thing, she doesn't live here any longer, but she lives outside of Atlanta, and she's a doll maker. And she was kind enough to bring a large group of her dolls up. We had a large reception and did a big exhibit of her Black dolls. And that type of thing we try to do, which educates people as far as what these people have accomplished after they've come to this community. Some of them have stayed here, some of them have left. But one year we did a quilt exhibit. We had a woman in the community who was 100 years old and still quilting. And Nellie gave us some of her quilts to display, and her family encouraged her to be here for an open house. So we try to let people know the rich heritage that the Black community has given to I call it the fabric of our community, because, or the patterns. If you look at a quilt, I mentioned quilts, and they, of course, have had a history with the Underground Railroad, because quilts with a star in the middle were often hung at places that were safe houses for escaping slaves. We weren't talking about Lost Creek people as far as having escaped and come here. They were freemen, but they helped slaves along the way through this community as they traveled north. So it's very interesting to look at the way that that Lost Creek kind of became the impetus for what has happened in the whole community of Terre Haute and Vigo County. The integration of professionals and people that settled here and moved from that area into the city. It's all just part of the pattern.
Really, before its time, honestly, in terms of how society can work, right?
Exactly, exactly. And nothing is ever perfect, but I think that's kind of a shining example of what can be done when good neighbors live together and work together.
Sure, absolutely. Finally, I wanted to ask you about Dorothy. We were able to meet up with her. She's a lovely woman, but just your thoughts on her and people like her who have been in the community for decades.
Yeah,
you know,
you're right.
She did leave, and she lived in Chicago, I believe, for
yes,
for
but then came back here and lived with
right.
Dorothy Ross, and her sister Geneva were two women that I met several years ago and fell in love with both of them. Geneva's no longer with us, but Dorothy, in her 90s, is still going strong. She and her sister were kind of the keepers of the history of the Lost Creek community, and today Dorothy is still doing that. Her home is kind of like a museum that relates to not only her family but the history of Lost Creek. And so she has done so much to preserve that history. Such a fun lady and so sharp, and it's been a pleasure to know her and to learn from her about the history of her family as well as the history of the Lost Creek settlement.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.